Almara was 10, small for her age, quick with her hands, and quieter than most people expected a child to be. She lived with her mother, Lydia, in a faded brick walk-up at the edge of a neighborhood the city pretended not to see. The hallway lights flickered. The elevator stuttered between floors. But inside their apartment, everything had a place. Shoes lined up by the door, tools wrapped in worn cloth under the bed, a chipped mug that always smelled faintly of engine oil because Almara used it to hold bolts and screws she found on her walks. The world outside felt sloppy and loud. The world they made inside felt careful, and that care kept them moving. Mornings began before the sun. Lydia set the kettle on the tiny stove, rubbed sleep from her eyes, and wrote a note on a scrap of paper before heading out to the diner across town. Almara woke to the soft scrape of the front door and the quick hush that followed. She ate porridge by the window while the street below yawned awake delivery trucks, a bus that sighed at the curb, the low rumble of cars that never seemed to stop for their block. She tied her laces tight, slid on her backpack, and tucked a folded cloth into the front pocket. Inside it was a stubby screwdriver and a small wrench. Little things for little problems. Tools were the one thing that made her feel ready. On the walk to school, she passed a corner store with the always watchful mirror and the cashier who tracked her every step as if curiosity itself could be a crime. She passed a vacant lot, where kids raced rusted bikes and dared each other to jump cracks in the concrete that ran like fault lines. She passed a mural of a smiling boy who wasn't there anymore. She didn't look too long at the mural, not because she didn't care, but because she'd learned that staring too hard at certain truths could make the day heavier than she could carry. At T-school, she took the back row, mostly by choice. It was easier to think when the attention wasn't stuck on her. She filled the margins of her notebooks with drawings, gears meshing, belts looping around pulleys, a chassis she imagined building from scrap. Some teachers praised her answers with an edge of surprise, like brilliance couldn't possibly come from a girl who fixed things in an alley. Others skipped over her hand, calling on students whose parents donated to the new scoreboard. She noticed the patterns, and they noticed her noticing. She learned to keep her face still, her voice even, her eyes bright but not too bright. The school had a robotics club that met in the shiny new wing with the polished floors. Almara lingered at the doorway sometimes, the way people linger outside bakeries when they're hungry but don't have enough for a loaf. She stood far enough away that no one could accuse her of anything, close enough to hear the buzz of motors and the soft click of plastic pieces snapping into place. A teacher once told her the club was full. She didn't argue. She went home and salvaged a cracked toy car from a trash bin, replaced its dead motor with one from a broken fan, and made it run again across the tiled kitchen floor. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. Afternoons belonged to the courtyard behind their building, where the sun stretched long across the concrete and the smell of laundry detergent drifted from windows. That was her workshop. She laid out her small cloth, arranged her tools, and opened whatever machine needed opening. A radio that hissed without sound, a bike chain jammed stiff with rust, a cheap watch that wouldn't tick. She loved that moment just after unscrewing the back plate when the inside revealed itself. So many tiny decisions held together, so many chances to set things right. Neighbors watched with a mix of puzzlement and pride. Mrs. Green brought her a bag of tangled headphones, and Almara coaxed sound out of them like a magician pulling scarves. Mr. Walker asked her to look at his lawnmower, and she found the clogged filter and cleaned it carefully until the engine coughed back to life. People started to say her name like a solution. When the radiator rattled or the fan refused to spin, they called on the little girl with steady hands. The attention felt good, but it didn't erase the other kind, the security guard in the pharmacy who always seemed to appear beside her, the clerk who double-checked her pockets with his eyes, the mother who pulled her child closer without saying a word. Lydia understood those unspoken messages too well. She came home after double shifts with shoulders rounded by effort and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She kept 3 uniforms ironed and ready, because pressed fabric was armor in a world that looked for reasons to judge. On her days off, She braided Amara's hair and told stories in soft, tired tones, stories of a grandmother who kept a shoebox of family papers, a grandfather who fixed radios on his porch and never turned anyone away. History sat at their small table, like a quiet guest, and Amara listened. She learned the names of people who crossed states with little more than patience and each other. She learned which parts of a story the world tried to erase, sometimes late at night, when the city sounds were thinner and the moon hung sharp above the rooftops. Amara would take a small ring from a dish on the dresser and slip it onto her finger. It wasn't large or extravagant. It was simple and beautifully made, the metal warm with handling, the edges worn smooth by time. She turned it slowly, letting the faint light catch on its surface. She didn't wear it every day. It felt like something to be careful with, like a key you didn't use unless you knew exactly which door it opened. On Saturdays, if Lydia finished early, they took the long bus that rattled toward the part of town with glass storefronts and watered trees. Amara pressed her forehead to the window and watched the neighborhood change block by block. Cracked paint turned to clean brick. Closed signs turned to open. The parking lots filled with cars that purred instead of sputtered, sleek bodies, trimmed edges, mirrors that folded themselves as if obeying a private language. She didn't envy them in the way people mean when they talk about envy. She loved the sound, the arrangement, the way an engine could be messy up close and perfect from a distance. There was a garage 3 stops past the bookstore where someone always seemed to be tuning something old and loud. Amara stood across the street and listened. The voice of a machine, when it ran well, felt like a song she could hum without words. She studied the way the mechanics moved, how they leaned into the work without fear, how they paused to listen, and then made the exact right adjustment. She imagined herself at a bench with drawers that slid open to reveal everything she needed, her name stitched on a patch above her heart. Not a fantasy about wealth, a vision of competence, of belonging. Not every day offered encouragement. A classmate once laughed at the dirt under her fingernails and asked why she always smelled like a shop. A volunteer at a community event placed her at the craft table but steered her away from the tool station. She learned the art of repositioning rejection into fuel. If a door didn't open, she found the hinge and studied it until she understood how to build a better one. She didn't say much about her ambitions. Holding them close felt safer, like cupping a flame in a wind you couldn't predict. Even so, hope had a way of threading through the hardest weeks. The box fan she repaired kept a neighbor cool during a heat wave. The speaker she soldered back to life turned a birthday into a celebration that lasted until the stars blinked awake. The bicycle she tuned helped a boy ride to his first job on time. These weren't headlines. They were small repairs to a world that too often broke in the same places. Late summer pressed down with a heat that stuck to the skin. The city slowed, then snapped at odd moments. Horns, short tempers, sudden storms that started and ended before anyone found an umbrella. On one of those afternoons, when the sky was a hard blue and the sidewalks shimmered, Amara finished her chores and set out with her backpack hanging loose from one shoulder. She followed her usual route, counting cracks, tracking the rhythm of passing cars without meaning to. Her mind wandered to a stubborn radio she'd left on the counter at home. She imagined the signal trapped like a moth behind glass, wanting to get out. At the corner near the bus stop, a sharp sound split the air, a cough of metal, a sputter that turned into a hiss. Amara's head snapped toward it. A vintage Mustang had rolled awkwardly to the curb, its hood trembling with complaint. Even from across the street, she felt the wrongness of it. The way you can feel when a song is offbeat by a fraction. Smoke leaked from the edges like a secret escaping. A man climbed out. His presence landed with weight. The suit, the watch that flashed when he checked the time. The posture of someone who expected the world to make room. He opened the hood with a practiced motion and stared at the engine as if it were a person who'd refused a direct order. Cars slowed to look. The heat shimmered. The Mustang, proud even in distress, let out another tired breath. Amara drifted closer, pulled by sound and instinct. She kept to the edge of the sidewalk, aware of the invisible lines that could change the tone of a moment. She saw loose clamps that should have been tight. She saw a hose that didn't sit right. She saw possibility, the kind of problem that had an answer if someone laid both patience and care on the table at the same time. Her fingers twitched toward the folded cloth in her pocket. The world narrowed to the machine, then widened again to include the man, the street, the weight of eyes that always seemed to weigh her differently. She thought about walking on. She thought about the radio at home in the cool of their apartment after the afternoon sun moved on. But another sound came from the engine, a wince disguised as a rattle, and turning away felt wrong. She took one step, then another. The air tasted like heat and exhaust. The sun made the ring on her finger flash once, just once, as her hand lifted without thinking. A small circle of metal. Nothing more than family to her, catching light in a way that could draw attention she hadn't asked for. Amara stopped at the edge of the curb, heart steady, mind clear. The world hovering in that fragile space before a decision becomes a story. She didn't know yet how quickly an offer of help could be twisted. She didn't know yet how heavy a simple heirloom could become. She only knew a machine needed care, and she had care to give. She stepped forward, unaware that the next few minutes would stretch into something larger than a broken car. Unaware that the smallest piece of metal on her hand would speak louder than skill or kindness. Unaware that once the hood lifted and the eyes of the street turned, nothing about this day would be ordinary again. The Mustang's hood was still steaming when Amara stepped closer. Most people her age might have hesitated. An expensive car, a well-dressed man, a situation that didn't look welcoming. But Amara had spent years around engines, watching her uncle tinker with old trucks, learning every sound and smell. She could tell this wasn't a catastrophic failure, just an overheating issue. Still, she hesitated for a breath, aware of the man's sharp suit, the polished shoes, the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her family's rent. He looked like the kind of man who wouldn't expect help from someone like her, but her instinct to fix, to help, pushed her forward. "Sir," she said carefully, standing at the curb, "I think I know what's wrong." The man, Mr. Cole, glanced at her first with surprise, then skepticism. His eyes flicked over her oversized backpack, her hand-me-down clothes, the way she clutched her sketchbook. For a moment, she thought he would wave her off, but something in his face softened, curiosity overtaking dismissal. You know cars?" Amara nodded, stepping closer. She kept her voice steady, hiding the small tremor of nerves. "Yes, sir. My uncle taught me. If you pop the hood, I can show you." Cole's hesitation lasted only a second. With a sigh, he pulled the lever inside. The hood clicked open. Steam rolled out, clouding the space between them. Amara reached in with practiced ease, her hands moving with confidence. She checked the coolant, spotted the cracked hose, and explained in simple terms. Cole leaned closer, his brows lifting not just because she was right, but because she spoke with a certainty most grown mechanics lacked. As minutes passed, bystanders began to slow. A few curious eyes landed on the unusual sight. A little black girl hunched over the gleaming engine of a millionaire's car. Whispers stirred, subtle but sharp. "What's she doing? She'll mess it up. Why's he letting her touch that?" The weight of those words pressed against Amara, but she kept working, steady and focused. When she finally straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans, she said, "It'll need a replacement hose soon, but I patched it enough to get you where you need to go." Her tone carried no boast, just calm explanation. Cole stared at her differently now, not just surprise, but something harder to define. Respect, perhaps, tangled with disbelief. He started to thank her, but his words froze when his gaze landed on her left hand. The ring. It wasn't flashy, just a simple band of silver with a faint engraving. To Amara, it was nothing more than a family keepsake, her grandmother's gift, passed down as a symbol of strength. But in Cole's eyes, it was something else. His expression darkened. He reached for her wrist without asking, pulling her hand closer. "Where did you get this?" His voice was sharp now, laced with suspicion. Amara froze, startled by the shift. "It was my grandmother's," she whispered, but Cole didn't look convinced. His jaw tightened. The crowd that had gathered leaned in, sensing drama. A young girl, fixing a millionaire's car, now accused of something unspoken. Someone murmured, "Looks expensive." Another whispered, Stolen, maybe? The murmurs spread like wildfire. Amara's heart pounded. She felt the sting of every eye on her, every doubt slicing into her skin. She wanted to speak, to explain, but a phone call pulled at the day's tension. Someone dialed authority, and the expectation of sirens rearranged a small universe around them. Authority often wore a uniform that translated messy moments into tidy classifications. In Amara's head, police appearances and other stories had come with danger rather than relief. She imagined being written into someone else's narrative and realized how quickly a child could become a suspect. When the officer stepped into the circle, he moved with practiced calm. His presence could be rescue or reinforcement of bias. Both possibilities sat in the same chair. He measured the scene in the currency he knew: statements and observable facts. His posture was professional, but his body language carried the cultural scripts he had learned. Who was likely to be a threat? Who a bystander? Who a victim? The officer converted people into checkboxes and events into lines for his report. Cole supplied a version that fit the simplest pattern: the expensive item and a poor child in proximity. The crowd accepted that frame eagerly. Narratives that confirm suspicion are like dry tinder. Amara wanted to point at the humming engine and show proof with the practical logic of oil and hoses, but the noise of accusation made her words thin and fragile. The ring pulsed with family memory, yet the world treated it like a clue in a crime. Tension accumulated in small, tangible ways. A hard-faced man near the curb moved with the pretense of curiosity toward the ring. His reach made breath catch collectively. In a flash, Amara saw the long line of incidents where a physical search had escalated into something much worse. The officer's hand shifted toward his belt reflexively. Community memory filled the space between them with images of consequences that did not return to ordinary. Amara's body shrank inward, mapping outcomes. Questioned, held, taken. Each possibility loomed large against her smallness. Something inside her steadied. She thought of faces who had relied on her competence. Her mother returning from a late shift, the neighbor whose fan she repaired, the boy who needed his bike. They were not abstractions. They were the ledger of her life. The ring on her finger was not a trophy of theft but a document of survival. Naming that in her head sharpened her breath and steadied her hands. Cole's grip tightened, an attempt to reclaim narrative control by force. The officer prepared the procedural step: identification, statement, perhaps an escort away from the scene for questioning. Procedure can feel neutral in theory, but in practice it moves a person from public visibility into institutional contexts, where nuance is lost. The crowd braced as if for the institutional machinery to roll forward and convert a heated moment into formal consequence. Then a new current split the rhythm. An older woman known on the block for her memory of who had lived where pushed through the outer ring of phones and shoulders with the purposeful pace of someone carrying history. She did not offer evidence like a document. She offered memory, the small, stubborn facts of neighborhood life: who had been forced from a house, who had kept what, who had sat on which stoop. Her voice carried the compact authority of lived seasons. With quiet insistence, she laid out a history that refused to be flattened by assumption. Her intervention changed the temperature. Some faces fell from certainty to hesitation. A few callers lowered their phones to listen. The officer's pen hovered. The act of recollection, ordinary and communal, began to refract the crowd's unanimity into shards. A young man across the street nodded toward the Mustang's steady purr, a practical confirmation of Amara's labor. Small gestures piled into a different narrative, fracturing the neatness of accusation but not erasing the hurt. Authority moves slowly to change course. The officer's training inclined him toward procedure, toward paperwork and formal steps. He suggested stepping aside for questioning. That administrative move felt neutral, but its consequences could be heavy. Moving a person out of a public, witness-rich space into a controlled environment where context often evaporates. Amara pictured her mother's face, Lydia, who balanced 3 uniforms like armor and carried exhaustion as a second skin. She imagined Lydia trying to understand, trying to defend a child stripped of dignity in front of strangers. Her hands that coaxed engines back to life felt suddenly like instruments of suspicion more than proofs of skill. The imagined separation from the block where she had built a ledger of trust made her breath short. Yet the neighborhood's memory had pushed back hard enough to tilt the moment. The older woman's recollection offered a counterclaim. A few others added witness. They had seen Amara at work, seen the fan she had made hum, the radio she had fixed, the lawnmower she had cleared. Those small, honest acts accrued like evidence of character. Cole's certainty eroded a few degrees. The crowd's unanimity splintered. The officer chose a middle path. Record statements, note observations, and refrained from immediate detention. The decision was procedural and fragile, a stopgap rather than absolution. Cole retreated toward his car with a tight jaw, the engine's purr now a hollow soundtrack to a claim that had not been fully owned. No apology came. The act of walking away became his reply. The aftermath was not clean. The humiliation of accusation lodged in Amara's memory like a pebble inside a shoe, small but inescapable. The officer's choice did not reconstitute her dignity. The crowd dispersed with guilty looks and viral fragments of video, the scene already feeding into an internet memory that would be hard to erase. But something else had shifted. The ring was no longer simply a flash that could be mistaken for ill intent. It had been spoken for by a neighbor who refused to let a small family history be flattened by presumption. The fact that a single voice could prevent an immediate harm was both relief and indictment. Relief that she was spared that day. Indictment that survival had depended on who chose to speak up. Amara stood with the imprint of a grip worm on her wrist. The street seemed ordinary again, but she had crossed a threshold. For a flicker of time she had been close to being erased by an easy assumption, and she had learned how fragile the illusion of safety could be. The event did not end with clean justice. It ended with procedure and neighborly memory nudging a moment back from the edge. She walked home with the ring warm against her skin and the knowledge that tools and skill could restore engines but not always restore certainty. The day had forced a new kind of vigilance on her young shoulders. Yet beneath the shock there was a stubborn truth. When history is remembered aloud, it can sometimes tilt a moment toward fairness. The question that remained, heavy and persistent, echoed after her steps. How many times must that memory rise before it becomes the rule rather than a chance rescue? Amara walked home slowly, her sneakers pressing into the cracked sidewalks with a heaviness that didn't match her age. Every step carried the residue of what had happened, the circle of strangers' eyes, the officer's clipboard, Cole's accusing grip, the silence of people who watched but said nothing. The neighborhood looked the same, kids still kicking a ball near the corner, a man still sweeping dust from his stoop, music drifting faintly from a second-story window. And yet, to Amara, everything felt altered. It wasn't just that she had almost been taken away for something she hadn't done. It was the way the world had turned so quickly, so naturally against her. The way suspicion leapt to her skin, her clothes, her presence, before a single word left her lips. She was still only a girl, but now she knew, in a way that was no longer abstract, that her innocence could vanish with one pointed finger. When she reached home, Lydia was already at the door, sensing the storm in her daughter's expression. Amara told the story in pieces, her voice trembling then flattening, as if retelling required her to build armor over the fresh wound. Lydia listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening with each detail. By the time Amara finished, silence filled the small living room. The sound of the refrigerator hummed, and beyond the window the neighborhood carried on. Lydia walked over and touched a ring still on Amara's hand. She lifted her daughter's fingers, stared at the metal, and whispered, "This ring has carried us through generations." But today, it carried something else. It carried the weight of their doubt. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She had no luxury for collapse. She pulled Amara close, and in that embrace lay two truths. She was proud. Her daughter had stood strong, and terrified that this was only the beginning. That night, Amara could not sleep. The scene replayed in her mind: the circle, the officer's shifting hand, the crowd's whispers, the possibility that her story could have ended differently. She thought of names she had seen on murals painted on city walls, young men and Women whose faces were immortalized because they hadn't survived their encounters with suspicion. For the first time, she realized how thin the line was between being a face in the crowd and becoming one of those painted faces. The following days brought a strange duality. On one hand, some neighbors approached Lydia at the market or on the street to say, "We saw what happened. It wasn't right. Your girl is good." They offered quiet validation, as if that would undo the public humiliation. But on the other hand, Amara felt the lingering stares, the unspoken thought hanging in the air. What if Cole had been right? Doubt clung to her like a second shadow. Even when no words were spoken at T-school, she sat in class while whispers floated behind her back. A friend asked softly, "Are you okay?" But others avoided her, afraid that proximity might taint them. 2. That was the cruelest part, how a false accusation could ripple outward, shaping not just the moment but the days that followed, leaving scars that couldn't be seen but were deeply felt. Lydia, meanwhile, wrestled with her own anger. She knew this wasn't just about her daughter, it was about every time she herself had been followed in a store, every time her co-workers had assumed she was less competent, every time her late husband had been pulled over simply for driving in the wrong neighborhood. It was all part of a long line, and now that line had reached Amara. The generational weight pressed heavier than ever, but Amara also felt something stir inside her, a flame that had been kindled by the injustice. She couldn't erase what had happened, but she could refuse to let it define her as a victim. She began writing in a notebook, pouring out the details, capturing the voices, the smells, the fear, and the indignation. She wanted it all documented, not for herself alone, but because she felt, in her bones, that if stories weren't told, they would be buried. And buried stories had a way of repeating themselves. Weeks later, when Cole drove past her on the same block, he avoided her eyes. He had not apologized, had not acknowledged the harm. To him, it was just another incident forgotten in the churn of his privileged life. But for Amara, it was unforgettable. That contrast, that some could walk away unscarred while others carried the wound forever, was perhaps the sharpest injustice of all. Still, the neighborhood remembered. The older woman who had spoken up that day stopped by with a pie, resting her weathered hand on Amara's shoulder. "Don't let them shrink you," she said firmly. "You're bigger than their fear. You're stronger than their doubt. Remember that." That blessing, simple as it was, became a kind of shield. Over time, Amara realized something else. What had almost broken her also connected her more deeply to others who carried similar stories. She began to notice the subtle exchanges in her community, the nod between two young men at the bus stop after a patrol car slowed near them, the way mothers gripped their children's hands tighter when entering certain stores. It was a shared language of survival, unspoken but deeply understood. And here lies the impact. Amara's story is not only hers. It is part of a wider pattern, a web of experiences that stretch across neighborhoods, across states, across generations. Her almost arrest was not an isolated incident. It was one page in a long book written in the ink of bias and fear. The truth is, for every Amara who returns home shaken but safe, there are others who do not. For every false accusation that ends in release, there are cases that end in handcuffs, in cells, in silence. That is why her story matters, not because it is unique, but because it is tragically common. As viewers, as listeners, we are faced with a choice. Do we let this be just another story that makes us shake our heads, shed a tear, and then move on? Or do we let it stir something deeper? Do we recognize ourselves in the bystanders, some who recorded but did nothing, others who spoke up and shifted the outcome? Which role would we play if the story unfolded in front of us? Because here's the truth. Racism does not sustain itself through dramatic events alone. It sustains itself through silence, through hesitation, through the countless moments when people choose not to speak up. It sustains itself through systems that treat suspicion as evidence and difference as guilt. Amara's story ended with her walking home, ring still on her finger, dignity cracked but not destroyed. But it easily could have ended differently. And tomorrow, someone else's story will end differently unless more people find the courage to act. So, I leave you with this. What would you do if you were in that crowd? Would you turn away, let suspicion swallow another innocent life? Or would you be the one voice that changes the ending? Because in the end, it's not just Amara's story. It's ours. It's America's. And the question is how many more Amaras must there be before we finally decide that enough is enough?